There is a moment when the sun disappears, when darkness falls, and you're left with just your fears. That's the moment you feel your first pang of doubt. That's the moment when the night comes out.
Episode 3, September Moon. Night brings its own terrors. For centuries, man has feared the darkness. Almost as long, humans have feared the moon. The tales of witches and werewolves and demons coming out during the full moon stretch back throughout the history of humankind. This is not a tale of werewolves, however. Despite this, the darkness here has teeth and claws, because sometimes the darkness bites when the night comes out. October 1st, 1964. Journal of Dr. Nathaniel Jarrell, Gemini Industries. The experiment is a failure. There's just no denying it now. Our attempts to try using a new chemical process to sterilize and slow down the breeding of the deer population around here has been a catastrophic failure. The first batch just outright killed the deer. For some, this would be an acceptable solution, but the general consensus is that this is not the best solution from a marketing standpoint. Instead, management thinks that wiping out deer by eliminating reproduction is a better option. The chemicals continued to kill the deer through a series of batches, some of them in slow, painful, and horrific ways. Batch 142, however, showed promise. Then it started to change the deer. Mutations began to occur, and they still got pregnant. The resulting offspring showed further mutations. Quite honestly, I've never seen anything like it. Yes, there were birth defects and missing limbs, but the other side effect was in creating deer that can only be described as smarter and aggressive. I don't know how else to explain it. I shudder to think what would happen should this chemical agent get out and taint the deer meat. What would it do to others who ate it? For instance, the local population of coyote. Can you imagine, in future generations, smarter and more aggressive coyote? I'd like to do more experiments and test the deer. However, the top brass said no, this is not going anywhere. The remaining deer are to be euthanized and disposed of. Too bad. I'd like to see where this could lead. Oh well. On to other experiments. Dale and Norman are not happy. They look at the pile of dead deer and then look at each other. This is what they do, of course. They pick up stuff like this and transport it. However, they are supposed to carry this stinking load of carcasses across the state of Illinois to someplace in Indiana where they will be burned. It's strangely warm out for this time of year, and the deer already stink. Plus, this Gemini Industries building is creepy, filled with local legends of gruesome experiments, and it's in the middle of freaking nowhere. "This place creeps me out," said Dale, pushing back the green and white trucker cap on his head. "What the fuck are they doing with all of these dead deer anyway? Being out here creeps me out." "Me too," agreed Norman. "They ain't paying us enough for this. What if we get some kind of weird deer disease?" "There ain't no deer disease, Norm," Dale said with a sigh. "No, but they do experiments and shit here," Norman said, waving his hand casually at the Gemini Industries buildings in the distance. The campus of Gemini was enormous, and Norman expected mutant things to pop out of the ground at any moment. That was believable if you allowed yourself to trust the local legends about what went on at this place. They do disease experiments and shit here. They got underground stuff that bangs molecules together and stuff. Shut up with that bullshit, Dale said. Let's get this done. They set about using a forklift to get the bodies of the deer into the truck. Dale noticed that some of the deer just looked funny. Their faces were twisted and weird, and there were babies mixed in with the adults. Some of the faces of the deer were filled with what Dale could only call fear. It took them the better part of 2 hours to get all of the bodies into the truck. This sucks, Norman complained. And we gotta drive way the hell out to Indiana with this rotting mess? That's what they want, Dale said. Both of them stood there and looked at each other for a while. Or, Norman said, raising his eyebrows. We can't, Dale said. If they found out, they'd not only take the money back, but never hire us again. Fuck them, Norman said. They wouldn't know. We drop them in the woods about 10 miles from here. You know, back by that deer stand we set up there a few years back, remember? You can take that dirt road and it's way back from the main drag. We'll put branches and shit over them and no one will know. Maybe the coyotes will come along and eat them before anyone could find them. Then we can go to Merle's place and get shit-faced and throw darts. Dale ran his hand through his greasy hair. He had promised to do the job and got paid well for it. However, there was no denying that Gemini was creepy, they were way the hell out in the middle of nowhere, and he was thirsty. The place Norman was talking about was well hidden, and he was right about the coyotes out here. It had been a hot summer, and he bet that they were hungry. Okay, Dale said at last. Let's do this fast. All right, Norman said with a smile, clapping his gloved hands together. They got into the truck and trundled off into the night. The coyotes traveled in a group of 2. The pickings had been slim so far that night, and that was just the latest in a series of hungry nights. The summer had been so hot, and now the autumn was looking to be equally warm. The male lifted his snout and sniffed the air. A stiff breeze blew up, and on the waves of that air, he caught a scent. A powerful scent. The male took 2 steps and looked back at his female companion. She lifted her head and sniffed as well. Then both of the coyotes lifted their heads back to sniff and then howled. Deer, meat, close by. Minutes later, they had wound their way around the trees. There, beneath the scent of deer meat, was the scent of men. Stinking men and their stinking machines had been here. They approached the pile of leaves and branches strewn haphazardly across the pile of meat cautiously. The men were gone, and they were hungry. Both of them fed well. September 8th, 2014. Mark Cross pulled his truck into the parking area. It was down a short dirt road and off into a flat dirt area not far from the construction site. Off in the distance, just to the immediate west, the new homes that they had already built were beginning to sparkle in the dawning light. They were on Phase 3 now, and that was the final one for this crew. There were already real estate guys showing the model home off on weekends. Mark had heard that some of the units were already sold, although the new residents had not moved in yet. Not far away, just a few miles, was the campus of Gemini Industries. The place was slowly closing down, which is why this land was now for sale and being developed. For decades, the place was infamous for spreading rumors about bizarre experiments. In truth, they had had a huge collider in the bowels of the thing, smashing atoms together to try and find some evidence of the Big Bang or something. Then someone built one of those colliders that was about 10 times bigger over in Europe, and now Gemini's campus out here was pretty much useless. None of that was on Mark's mind that morning. He was still wiping the sleep seeds out of his eyes and taking large sips from the coffee mug on his hand. He always got there early. He liked to watch the sun coming up over the horizon as he fired up the bulldozer. The rest of the crew always arrived later, or sometimes just outright late, but these moments he had to himself. They were working later too these days because the September moon was so bright. In the fields that were a few miles away, they could often hear farmers out in their fields, harvesting under the bright moon. Mark decided he wanted to finish his coffee on the dozer that morning instead of inside the single-wide trailer that served as their field office and break room. Max, the manager, would be in before too long since he was usually the second to show. Mark's job with the dozer was getting close to being finished. They would start digging the foundations and laying the cement soon. Then the crew would move on to the frames of the house and so on. In a few months, Mark would be able to drive past this place, point out the window, and say, "I helped build all of that." Mark got into the bulldozer and situated his coffee in the plastic holder he had affixed to the interior. Usually, the cup vibrated so much that he ended up spilling a lot of it, but enough of it stayed to keep him properly caffeinated. He quickly started up the dozer, the huge machine rumbling and coughing to life, and belching black and brown smoke out of the stack above the driver's cabin. Mark shifted the levers and backed the machine up. In front of him was more dirt that needed to be moved, so the earth could be smoothed. Mark felt most at home in this cabin. He had loved the machines when he was a kid, and his parents would go out of their way to find construction sites, so Mark could look at the cranes, bulldozers, and ditch diggers. They were so massive, so cool, and yet they were controlled by men. Mark had learned to operate most of the machines in the construction industry since then, and had spent some time in the big cities building massive skyscrapers. He was liking this, though, because it was quiet out here, and because it was so empty, there were no neighbors to complain about the early morning noise. The massive blade lowered to the ground and a mass of earth was churned up, pushed relentlessly forward by the massive machine. The seat bounced Mark up and down, but up ahead, the sun was starting to crest the treetops and blaze across the construction site. The smell of fresh earth filled Mark's nose. He drove the bulldozer up the mountain of earth and deposited the mass he had been pushing. Mark reversed the bulldozer and made his way back to the start of the run, shifted the machine, and began pushing another mound of earth. On it went. The bulldozer drowned out all other noise and lulled Mark into his sense of contentment and purpose. The mound of earth grew and grew, and the ground behind him smoothed out nicely. The heat of the day was starting to kick into gear as the sun rose and the world came to life. The dozer moved fast, but not too fast that Mark felt rushed. He had made his way back to the start of the run and swung back around, pushing more earth, when suddenly, something appeared on top of the mound of earth. "What the fuck?" he muttered. He brought the bulldozer to a halt. It rumbled and groaned, but it did not move forward. It was a coyote. A big one. A really big one. The beast stood on top of the mound, silhouetted against the rising sun. With the rays of the sun beaming all around it, it was almost impossible to distinguish color, and it appeared like a shadow, all black. Its ears were up, and its head faced Mark, the bushy tail standing straight back. But holy cow, was this a big coyote! Mark had seen many, even seen them running across the construction site before, but they were always about the size of his medium-sized dog, 30 pounds. This was as big as a German shepherd, or bigger, maybe even closer to wolf size, but there were no wolves in these parts. Mark stared at the coyote for a while. The coyote stared back, then started panting with its tongue lolling out of the side of its mouth. Mark laughed and then gunned the engine. This was kind of weird and a little cute, but he had work to do. Mark let the brake go and eased the bulldozer forward just a few inches. The sound of the machine was usually enough to scare away any coyote. Coyote were usually not confrontational, preferring to be opportunistic hunters. This one just stood there. Mark frowned. Then he gunned the engine again. He lifted the blade of the bulldozer as high as it would go and then slammed it down. That usually shook the earth so hard that any animal would run. In fact, about 50 yards away, a group of geese took flight. The coyote just stared at the bulldozer. Mark laughed. This was odd, but not scary. The sun was bright, the day was warm, the sky was cloudless. He wondered if this was a coyote that someone somewhere had been feeding and it was almost domesticated. Mark got out of the bulldozer, the engine still running, and stepped to the end of the dozer blade. The coyote licked its lips, but did not move, its eyes never leaving Mark's. "Come on now," Mark yelled. He clapped his hands and then waved his arms over his head. "Make a lot of noise," they always said. "It scares away coyotes. They never attacked people," they always said. "Come on, scoot! I have work to do, yeah!" The coyote lowered its head a bit, but didn't move. Mark stood up and cocked his head to the side. Okay, this was fun for a bit, but this was getting weird and a tad creepy. Mark stepped forward, out beyond the blade of the bulldozer now. He waved his hands in the air and screamed. Then he jumped up and down. "Move!" The coyote tilted its head to the side, but did not budge. Mark moved closer, now at the base of the mound of dirt. He grabbed a clod of the dirt and threw it at the coyote's feet. "Get out! Now! Go!" This time, the coyote lowered its head, cocked its head to the side for a moment, and growled. It was low, so low that Mark could just barely hear it over the sound of the bulldozer engine. Then the coyote bared its teeth, and Mark felt his legs go weak. What the fuck? They never attack unless you corner them, unless you were injured and tried to run. They did not attack people. Mark knew that as well as he knew his own name. Maybe this one was sick? Oh, geez, a rabid coyote? Wouldn't he be foaming at the mouth? Mark began to back away slowly. The coyote stood up, still growling, teeth bared. It did not leap. It did not run. Instead, it began to descend the mound of earth, its feet stepping with confidence. Mark felt the blade of the bulldozer bump against him. Okay, fella, sorry, it's okay. Get in the dozer, he thought. Get in, try to use it to scare it away, and then head for the office. Get into the office and call someone, anyone. Mark turned, and his knees nearly gave out. There was a coyote standing in the cabin of the bulldozer. It was easily as big as the one that had been at the top of the dirt mound. It was also gray, but its head was lowered, teeth bared. It had flanked him, jumping up there while Mark was distracted with the coyote on the hill. Jesus. Mark looked to his right. He could see clearly to the office trailer. There were no other animals there. Mark held out both hands, palms facing forward, trying to convey to both coyotes that he was unarmed and meant them no harm. He moved sideways and then backwards, heading slowly toward the office, keeping his eyes on both animals. His heart thudded in his chest, and he heard a wheezing sound that he soon realized was the air rushing in and out of his lungs. Movement caught his eye. A third coyote came out from the other side of the bulldozer blade, big, gray, growling. Mark had lived out in this area for a long time. Coyotes were fairly common. Every year, particularly when coyote mating season came around, a news station would go over everything people needed to know about coyotes to protect their children and their pets. Coyotes usually traveled in pairs. They avoided humans as much as possible. They were potentially dangerous to small animals and could be aggressive against them, but were fearful of people. There were only a few cases of them attacking humans, and in those cases, the human had been sick or injured and had run. The running set off their instinct to attack. Just make noise, scare them away. Great, he thought, but what happens when they're as big as wolves and didn't scare? Mark knew that the ground was smooth. He was the one who had smoothed it. Up ahead, the coyote in the bulldozer's cabin made its way to the ground. The one that had been up on the hill took the lead, teeth still bared, moving slowly. The third one took up the rear of the line. Their heads were low, their bushy tails high, and their eyes never leaving Mark. They were stalking him. Christ, 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 Mark muttered. He dared a glance behind and saw the trailer was close, but still far away. When he turned around, he gasped. The coyotes were now incredibly close. A second later, the first of the coyotes leaped at him. Mark screamed and covered his head, diving to the ground out of pure instinct. He felt the massive body of the canine travel over his head and land on all four legs behind him. Mark stood and just ran. This time he was headed for his car, digging in his pocket for his keys. Behind him, he heard the coyotes growl, and then there were a series of barks. He threw a glance behind and saw that there were now 5 coyotes after him. They were closing fast. Mark could not find his keys. He let out a cry of despair, his car coming up fast, promising salvation. Then his fingers closed around the keyring, and he yanked the keys free. He slammed into the driver's side door, rocking the car. Reflected in the windows and the shiny metal of the door, he saw the glowing eyes of the coyotes as they ran, closing fast. The car rocked again, and something wet dripped on Mark's hand. Mark looked up, and there was a coyote on the roof of his car. The beast was close enough that Mark could smell its breath and feel it against his forehead. The eyes were dark, brown, and seemingly bottomless. The teeth were bright white and sharp, and it growled low and loud. Mark turned and saw the other 5 coming straight at him, but they had slowed down now. Mark dove under the car, scrambling and clawing, his hands grabbing gravel and dirt under the vehicle. The coyotes continued barking and growling. Mark looked around desperately. He could see their noses sniffing around the car, circling and sniffing at his boots and leg. Their growling came from everywhere. How long before they realized that they could get under here? Mark looked around with panic growing inside of him. They were everywhere. He had lost count of the number of them. 6, 7 now? Mark tried to turn around, but it was hard to do. There was not a lot of space between the bottom of the car and his head. All around him, he heard the coyotes growling and sniffing. One of them tried to get under and snap at him, but Mark was able to pull his hand away in time. It went on that way for a little while. Mark lost all sense of time. How long before the rest of the guys got there? Maybe an hour? 2? If they weren't running late, that seemed about right. Could he stay under there for that long? It was getting hot out now as the sun got higher. That would make things uncomfortable, but not unbearable. What if the animals got under the car? Where would he go? Mark's mind was racing as his body lay still. He had nothing to throw or use as a weapon. In the car above him, he had a tool belt, but that did little good to him under the car. He could see his keys, however, just a few feet away, just barely outside the shadow of the car. On that keyring, he had a small pocket knife. Hardly a decent weapon, but a blade was better than no blade. Mark watched the paws and legs of the coyotes for a moment, trying to time them. When he felt there was a bit of space to his left, he scrambled to the left, sticking his hand out for a moment, and grabbed the keys. A second later, the teeth of a coyote snapped at the space where his wrist had been. Mark brought the keys to his face and found the pocket knife. He extended the blade. It was dirty and a bit dull from opening packages and cutting zip ties, but the edge was still pretty sharp and the point was fine. He felt like an idiot hoping to fight off these animals with a blade that was less than 2 inches long and thinner than a pencil. It was all he had. Suddenly, there was a loud creaking sound, and the car jostled above his head. The front end got lower, reducing what he could see and how far above his head the bottom of the car was. "What the hell?" he whispered. Then there was another squeak and creak, and the front end went down again. The car rocked above him. Then it happened again. It took Mark a minute to realize that the coyotes were jumping up on the hood of the car. Their weight must have been tremendous, the beasts all made up mostly of muscle. The front end of the car was getting lower and lower. "Jesus," Mark whispered. There was another creak, and then another. The front end was really low, scraping the top of his head. How many could the car stand? How heavy were they? Mark suddenly felt very claustrophobic. He had to get out of here. He scrambled backwards, moving away from the front end. His breath wheezed in and out of his lungs. His hands dug into the gravel beneath, one hand gripping the tiny blade. That was when the coyote he had not even seen at the rear of the car clamped down on his jeans. Mark yelped. He felt the teeth scraping his ankle, and then he was being yanked backwards. "No!" Mark screamed. "No, no, 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 no!" Now his legs were out to the knee. Then they were out to the upper thighs, his waist. Mark frantically dug into the dirt and gravel with his hands, but the ground was still too loose. There was nothing to grab onto, and he was halfway out at this point. Mark tried to flip over on his back, but the teeth held him firmly. He hoped that his jeans might tear, giving him a chance to move away, but that didn't happen either. The sun shone into his eyes as his shoulders came out from under the car. Now Mark flipped onto his back. The coyote that was dragging him was the biggest he had seen yet. The teeth were bared. The eyes looked golden in the sunlight. Mark gripped the small blade in his hand and did all he could. He sat up and thrust forward with the blade. The blade stabbed into the coyote's left eye, and the beast let go of his jeans and let out a horrendous yelp. Mark was on his feet in a flash. The coyotes on the hood of the car were jumping down and heading for the rear. The one Mark had stabbed was yelping and turning in circles. Mark ran. He ran for the office trailer. There was just enough of an opening as the coyotes ran to their injured pack member and looked about confused for just a moment. Then the growling and barking started, and Mark heard them running for him. The trailer got closer and closer. Safety. He had the keys in his hand. It was just a short 3-step staircase, and then he would be at the door. He could get the keys in and get inside. Once he was inside, he could use the desks and furniture to hole up until the rest of the guys got there. It had to work. It had to work. That was when one of the coyotes came out of nowhere and clamped its jaws down on his right hand. It was like being hit by a car. Mark let out a gasp and then a yell of pain and surprise. The beast was so big and heavy that his arm was almost yanked out of socket, and Mark flipped into the air and landed on his back. The teeth dug into his flesh, and he felt blood running down his forearm. Mark was winded and tried to scream, but his lungs were compressed. The pain was so great, and he thought maybe his arm was broken. The coyote shook its head, and Mark felt more flesh tear away from his arm. Flecks of blood spattered against his face. The hand in the coyote's mouth still clutched the knife, but he couldn't move it and use it against the coyote. Mark lashed out with his left hand. He punched the coyote on the snout. The coyote bared down and shook its head again. The other coyotes were coming. Mark could hear them. How long before they tore him into pieces? Mark dug his hands into the gravel, and his fingers closed around something solid. It was a rock, just barely buried in the dirt. Mark hauled with his might and the rock pulled up, filling his hand. As the coyote shook its head, tearing more of his flesh from his bones, he swung the rock in his hand. There was a loud thunk and cracking sound as the rock came down right between the coyote's eyes. The dog let out a short yelp and then collapsed to the ground, releasing Mark's arm. Mark got to his feet just as another coyote slammed into him from behind. Mark and the coyote fell to the ground, and the air left Mark's lungs in a rush. The beast tumbled end over end and then scrambled to its feet. Blood ran from his hand and arm and spattered on the ground. The rest of the coyotes gathered behind him. They were cutting him off from the trailer. Mark looked over at the bulldozer. It was another run, but the way was clear at the moment. Mark bolted. He heard the group of coyotes behind him immediately start running right after him. They were growling, snarling, their feet pattering against the gravel. The bulldozer was only a few yards away, but it felt like miles. Mark dared not look behind him, and he just ran. His lungs were still screaming from being slammed to the ground. His legs hurt, his arm was bleeding, spattering against the gravel. He felt faint. He expected the coyotes to reach him at any moment and tear him apart. Instead, he reached the bulldozer. Mark flung himself up into the cabin. He grabbed the controls and belched the machine into life. As the engine roared, so did Mark. He whirled the machine around and the massive blade faced the oncoming coyotes. He could see, from this height, that there were at least a dozen of them out there. They were very close, and they backed away once the dozer swung towards them. One of the coyotes lay near the trailer, its head bleeding into the gravel. The one whose eye he had stabbed was among the crowd, gore dripping down its face, teeth bared. "Come on, motherfuckers!" Mark yelled in triumph. He throttled the engine and drove the bulldozer forward. The treads kicked up dirt and then caught, sending him lurching forward. The coyotes scattered, but did not run away. They moved out of the way of the blade, but did not leave the construction site. One of the coyotes stepped forward and leaped toward the bulldozer. Mark swung the bulldozer around, and the coyote rebounded off the metal cabin. Mark heard a yelp, and the animal fell on its back right near the treads. Mark swung the dozer around and then forward. There was a crunch and a yelp, and another coyote was down. "Who is next?" Mark screamed. Mark swung the bulldozer around yet again. The coyotes scattered. Mark swung it around in a circle and was now facing the office trailer again. He drove the bulldozer forward. And then the engine coughed, and coughed again. Then it died. What? Mark felt a hand grab his heart. He immediately fumbled with the controls. The engine was silent. There was, however, the sound of almost a dozen coyotes growling at him. Then he smelled it. Gasoline. "No," he whispered. Mark looked down and could see the fuel lines beneath the cabin. It was like everything was magnified in his mind. He could see that the lines had been chewed. Chewed. The coyotes had chewed the fuel lines. The machine drained of its fuel, and Mark's blood pressure went up. One of the beasts leaped at the cabin of the bulldozer. It landed nimbly, and Mark let loose a scream and dove forward. He heard the jaws of the beast snapping closed in the space where Mark had just been. He tumbled over the front of the bulldozer, his feet sliding and just barely finding his footing. His arm throbbed. More blood spattered down on the dozer. He heard the paws of the coyote in the cabin hitting the metal of the bulldozer and coming right after him. Mark reached the edge of the bulldozer and leaped into the air, blindly, just hoping he would land in a patch that was clear. He was lucky. His knees gave out the moment he hit the dirt. Mark screamed as he rolled over his ravaged arm. Mark saw stars in front of his eyes and felt panic enter every part of his body. The sound of paws and growling beasts filled his ears, and he felt something grabbing at his right shoe. No! Mark kicked out with his right leg and hit something which let out a yelp and let go of his shoe. Mark got to his feet, trying not to notice the sound of his own blood spattering against the ground. Then Mark looked up. He was right in front of the stairs leading to the trailer, just a few more steps. Where are the keys? Mark wasn't even aware that he was talking out loud. His hand was empty. He had dropped the keys. Jesus! Mark looked around. There, over there, by where the dog had grabbed his arm, right in front of the body of the coyote whose head he had caved in, were the keys, glinting in the early morning sun. Something grabbed at the back of Mark's shirt as he dove toward the body of the dead coyote. He felt the shirt pulling him back for a second, and then heard the sound of fabric tearing. He hit the ground again, rolling, as another beast snapped at his ear. There was a brief flare of pain and heat on the left side of his head, and he felt blood running down the side of his face. His fist closed around the keys, and then Mark was on his feet. He ached everywhere. His arm was now going numb. His head spun. He had lost so much blood. How many? How many were coming for him? How many steps? A dozen? More? His foot hit the metal stairs and he nearly went sprawling. He caught himself and ran up the remaining steps. He fumbled with the keys, wheezing, panicking, his fingers slipping over the keys. Jesus, where was the fucking key? His hand closed over it and he jammed it into the lock. A second later, he opened the door and dove inside, slamming the door behind him. A second after that, something large and growling bashed its body against the door, denting it inward. Mark flung his body against it and through the lock. Then he sank down to the floor, his back against the door, and wheezed like an asthmatic. Outside, he heard the coyotes barking, growling, and howling. How long would that door hold? This place wasn't meant to be a fortress. If they all came charging at the door and threw themselves against it, the door would come flying in. Mark struggled to his feet. He felt like he was going to faint. He spared a glance at his arm and then turned away. There was too much blood there, and the wound looked deep and black. He reached up and touched the blood running down his face. He had lost part of his ear, apparently. Mark could only guess how many bruises he had and how many muscles he had pulled. His ribs felt bruised, too. Mark walked over to the windows that overlooked the parking lot. He limped, his right knee sending bolts of pain up his body with each step, his wounded arm held to his side. The blinds were closed, and Mark parted them. There were at least 10 coyotes out there, all of them in a semicircle around the trailer. Their teeth were still bared. They were barking and growling and yelping. Mark grabbed the phone off the desk. It was dead. Did they cut the lines? He asked. It would have been a ridiculous idea just 2 hours ago. Mark backed away from the windows. He needed to wait for the rest of the crew to get here. What would happen when they got here? Would Mark get to sit here and watch them all get torn apart? Mark ran his hand through his hair and began to pace. He walked to the far end of the trailer. When he got halfway across, he froze. The trailer was raised off the ground a bit, like a standard trailer. That allowed there to be a bit of a crawl space beneath the trailer. That was there for safety purposes since there was no back door. If the front door was suddenly covered in flames, you could dive through a trapdoor in the floor and crawl out. The trap door was open. Mark froze. The trailer was not that big, but there were no lights on inside. That meant that the hallway that led to the offices at the far end was dark. From within those shadows came a low, rumbling sound. "No," Mark whispered. It was the biggest one yet. This coyote was gray and huge, one eye bearing a very old scar. It had to have been 80 pounds. It came out of the shadows with its huge white teeth bared. No. Mark whispered. They stared at each other for a few seconds. Mark tried to make his feet move, but they felt rooted to the spot. His bladder let go. Then, the coyote leaped at him, and Mark saw fur and teeth and heard it growl. And then there was pain. And then there was nothing. September 8th, 2014. Journal of Dr. Nathaniel Jarrell, Gemini Industries. I thought that I had seen it all, and then today everything changed. It has been more than 50 years since I thought about those experiments in deer population control. It was so long ago. I've moved on, won awards for my other discoveries in the field of natural science. These days I don't do much at the lab, but putter around and look at other people's work. When you're in your 80s, they wonder why you aren't dead or retired. What else would I do? Science is all that I have ever known. I can't retire and just take up gardening. Now, however, I know fear again. Someone brought in the bodies of several coyotes. They were killed at a construction site not far from where our labs once thrived. Despite what is buried in that ground, they are building houses there. God help them. These coyotes apparently killed 2 workers, one that got there early in the morning to operate a bulldozer, and then a second one after he arrived on the site. One coyote had been killed with the bulldozer, another with a rock, and one more had been shot. The rest of the pack vanished. All of this is being hushed up by the powers that be here at Gemini. I was called down to see the bodies of the coyotes. Gigantic. The reports of how the coyotes behaved give me chills. Their ancestors must have eaten the deer that were ordered to be transported and destroyed. 50 years later, and many generations later, mutation after mutation has created these beasts. Aggressive, intelligent, strong, working together in a pack much larger than any normal coyote. This experiment has been my biggest secret and my biggest fear. I stepped outside to get some fresh air, filled with terror over what might be. The full September moon beat down, making the night less dark. Then I heard howling in the distance. Mournful, loud baying at the fat white moon. It was a very hot summer. The coyotes must have had it rough. Drought has inflicted itself in this area. Already there are reports of livestock dying from the heat. Predictions are that this winter will be tough too. All that is to say that those coyotes are out there, and they are hungry. Dear God, perhaps this is what happens when you live too long. You get to visit your sins before you die. The pack had moved on, in search of more humans. They had lost 3 of their 15. Did that justify their forays into the human world? The humans continued to intrude into their domain, offering themselves up like a buffet. The pack leader bayed at the moon. The huge September moon hung over them, and they all wailed, tilting their heads back, howling, mourning their dead. The pack leader was old, scarred, but still strong. He would lead them as he always had. They would find food. The alpha could sense that more humans were coming, and he would learn from this experience. They would find new ways to hunt them. They would feed. They would survive. Beneath the September moon, he howled as loudly as he could. It was his promise that the pack would survive. Have you ever heard the howls at night as the coyotes rove the woods in their hungry packs? As a human, you probably have nothing to worry about, right? You have nothing to worry about when the night comes out. You've been listening to When the Night Comes Out, a weekly horror anthology podcast with stories by Brian W. Alaspa and narrated by Allie James. For Brian's work, visit his website at www.brianwalaspa.com or visit amazon.com for his books of fiction and nonfiction. Be sure to listen to Allie's work on Facebook at Allie James Projects.